Hello and welcome to Novara Live. Apologies for the slight delay today. I'm Michael Walker, as usual. And in the second half of tonight's show, I'll be joined by Helena, aka NoJustice MTG. We'll be discussing rents having soared since 2021, where Streeting announcing that the temporary ban on puberty blockers is becoming indefinite. And we will talk all about the latest developments when it comes to Luigi Mangione. You know who he is by now, don't you? He's the very attractive man who has been accused of assassinating a healthcare CEO. Stay tuned for all of that. First, though, thank you to everyone who has signed up to become a monthly supporter over the past week. We've been putting out our new fundraising video. It's because of you that Novara Live is able to happen every weeknight. If you're one of our viewers that tunes in every week but hasn't yet signed up, do please consider supporting us with a monthly donation so we can have an even bigger impact next year. To do that, go to novaramedia.com/support. Our standard ask is for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month, but whatever you can afford or you feel you can offer us, we really, really do appreciate it. Let's go straight into our first story. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Khamenei, has spoken publicly for the first time since the fall of his ally, Bashar al-Assad. He said this, so speaking in Tehran, he said, "There should be no doubt that what happened in Syria is the result of a joint plan between the United States and the Zionists. Yes, a neighboring government of Syria is playing, and will continue to play a clear role in this matter. Everyone sees this, but the main actors, the principal agents, the real plotters, the masterminds, and the command center are America, and with the Zionist regime. We have evidence. This evidence leaves no room for doubt." He also went on to say, this is the resistance front. The more you push, the stronger it gets. The more you commit crime, the more motivated it becomes. The more you fight them, the wider they become. I tell you, with the divine power of God, the extent of resistance will cover the whole region more than before. Now, the idea that Assad's fall has strengthened Iran's axis of resistance seems somewhat far-fetched. And with the decapitation of Hezbollah and now the fall of Assad, by most standard assessments, Iran looks like a far weaker force in the region than it was a year ago. Of course, though, it's very early days. It will take a while for the dust to settle in Syria. In the meantime, the Western media has continued to report on evidence of Assad's greed and of his regime's brutality. First, this is CNN on the greed front, reporting from one of Assad's garages.
So, John, we are actually here in one of several garages belonging to Bashar al-Assad. We are on the compound of the presidential palace, and you can see this is a man who had expensive tastes. We've seen Aston Martins, we've got Lamborghinis, we've got Ferraris. I want to add as well that we've been walking through this compound. There are many garages. We were just in a lot where there were dozens and dozens of armored cars, if you can believe that. I don't know how anyone would need so many armored cars. And I'm bringing you over here because you can see this collection of classic cars over here. And the reason this is all significant, John, the reason that we're talking about this, that we're showing you this, is because really this is indicative of the deep, deep corruption of the Assad regime.
And we saw earlier in the week, didn't we, images of people looting Assad's palace. Clearly, it seems it didn't get to the garage. Hopefully, you know, those retro, expensive cars will be sold off to help rebuild Syria. Channel 4 News, this is on the brutality side of the equation, visited a site showing the other side of Assad's regime. This is the notorious Sednaya prison.
Thousands have died and gone missing inside these walls since 2011. The torture and the murder is well documented. But being inside is different. And being brought in by a mother looking for her 3 sons is something else entirely. She brings us to the giant iron press. She and others told us it was used to compact the bodies of the executed for easier disposal.
مكبس عالم
This grotesque machine, again, well documented. We spent the best part of 2 days here, saw and heard accounts of unspeakable things. But some of the worst were the hundreds of calculated humiliations administered to every person every day. Muhammad was tortured here for 6 years, set free 2 days ago. But it's the smaller things he remembers.
يفوتوا لنا شاي مثلا يفوتوا لنا بالشاي الجاط هالقد فيه كبوا لنا اياه بالارض نحن الشاي شلون نلاقيه طب بدنا نشرب نحن بدنا شيء حلو يعني لجسمنا نجيب السفنجل نعصر بالسفنجل نعصر بالكاسات البلاستيك اللي عندنا.
Then the guards would stand there laughing at them.
There's a really tragic scene sort of later in that Channel 4 report of lots of people sort of lined up looking through documents trying to see if their loved ones could be found, you know, the assumption being that many of them might have been executed or could be anywhere, really. To talk about the latest developments surrounding Assad's fall, I'm joined now by Paul Rogers, Emeritus Professor of Peace Studies at Bradford University. Paul, thanks for coming back on the show. I wanted to begin by asking you about that claim from Iran's leader. Do you buy the idea that everything we've seen over the past few days was masterminded by Israel and the Americans?
No, I don't buy that idea, but there is a huge amount that we don't know. There are many major indications of some sort of close affinity, but masterminding, I really do doubt. The Israelis obviously work very closely with the Americans. It is worth noting that as soon as this extraordinary move from the whole HTS group and going on the road and the rest, almost from the start, there was very heavy airstrikes by Israel. And we tend to forget that I think it was last Sunday, the US Air Force Central Command staged a whole series of raids against what it said were ISIS units, 75 different raids, including the huge B-52 bomber. Now, I don't know whether that was pre-planned or all set should the regime fall, but certainly there's a lot that has been going on, which I think will only seep out very slowly. But the idea that this is completely organized by Israel and the United States, I find it very difficult to buy into that. But you must really sort of reserve judgment. Within the next 2 or 3 years, much more will come out of this. I think there will be many surprises. And
when it comes to the other sort of part of the statement from Khamenei, which is that, you know, this won't weaken the axis of resistance, it will only strengthen their sort of their desire to resist. It does seem sort of fairly clear that this has been a big blow for Iran, not just the fall of Assad, but also the decapitation of Hezbollah.
Yes, it has. Iran is in a weaker position now, without question. It's also been a very bad week or so, of course, for Russia too. If Russia succeeds in maintaining its pretty precarious hold in Syria, both in terms of air power and the small naval facility at Tartus on the Mediterranean coast, then all will be pleased. But for the moment, that is really very much up in the air. It's one of the many things we don't know. But overall, it does indicate there's been a change in the balance of power or influence in the Middle East, at least in the short term. And the winners in the short term will obviously be the United States and very much Israel, and of course also Turkey, which we do tend to forget about, because Turkey probably would not have been, well, this whole assault on the regime and successful assault probably wouldn't have been possible without a lot of support from Turkey towards HTS. So in that sense, I think we're seeing a complicated situation. And I would have to say changing almost by the day. I mean, what we've seen in the last, 36 hours is the way in which the Israelis have basically engaged in two major operations simultaneously. One is a huge set of air raids, almost unbelievable, using almost all the resources, in which they set out as much as they can to destroy as much of the military system within Syria as they can. The Navy, which admittedly was very small, it was offshore patrol boats and I think a single corvette, that has been destroyed, and essentially the ships have been sunk. There have been attacks on a whole range of air bases, squadrons of planes have been destroyed. There's no opposition to this. I think what Israel is doing is making sure that whatever happens in Syria, whatever entity, regime, coalition takes power, will be extremely weak in military senses. And I think because one has to remember that as far as Assad was concerned, at least he was a dictator with whom the Israelis could deal, at least privately. That has gone, and it's the uncertainty which I think is concerning the Israelis, leading them to respond in this very strong way.
And I suppose you've said sort of this strengthens the position of the Americans and Israel in terms of a regional conflict with Iran, let's say. It could presumably also backfire for them, right? I mean, is there a sort of level of disorder that could break out in Syria that would cause problems for Israel or Turkey? I mean, there's obvious ways it could cause problems for Turkey or the United States.
Yes, very much so. And this is going to depend really on what this group, HTS, actually succeeds in doing. The hope was that when it got into a degree of power in Damascus and had influence across quite a lot of Syria, it would be possible to form a coalition of parties that were actually looking towards the future for Syria. That so far has not happened. In fact, the group itself, I mean, under Jalani himself, has formed a sort of an interim government drawn entirely from, if you like, his own people, the Islamist faction. And that is where we are now. So the whole idea is really whether some sort of coalition can form, which takes in a number of the different groups. We've got to remember how many there are. You know, obviously, Israel down in the southeast is doing a straightforward land grab to take more of the Golan Heights and maybe even move further into Syria itself. But beyond that, I mean, you have one major group in the northwest, essentially usually called, well, most commonly it's called the Syrian National Army, but in many ways people think it's the Syrian National Turkish Army. You have that in the northwest. In the northeast, you have the groups allied to the Kurds, supported to some extent by the Americans, and they've been very prominent in the destruction of ISIS. ISIS still exists in some parts of Syria, as it does indeed in some parts of Iraq. And the United States has been doing air raids against ISIS units, over the last 2 or 3 years, rarely reported. And of course, the United States itself still has nearly 1,000 troops in Syria itself. And then you have other groups in the east and the south, which are all developing their own capabilities, and they're not necessarily going to come together. I mean, at the moment, it's marvelous the way we've seen people able to try and find a degree of peace and more stability in what was a terrible regime. But we're not out of the woods on this. And it's going to be very difficult to see how you can get a degree of, well, sort of unanimity in a country which has been so torn apart and also is incredibly weak economically. I don't want to be very pessimistic. It's probably sounding that way. But the reality is there are a lot of uncertainties. If all goes well, and it's a long answer to your question, if all goes well, some sort of beginnings of a coalition will stretch across much of the country, may form in the next 2 or 3 weeks. If that happens, then I think things will look a lot better than they do at present if you're taking a rather jaundiced view of where we might go.
Well, stay with me because I want to go to a couple of reports about what's currently happening in Syria, which actually seem fairly positive. You know, I'm not sure if necessarily they're maybe being a bit too positive, if there's some wishful thinking going on here. But first of all, we can go to a report from the BBC. This is a report from Damascus. It mentions some concerns about the makeup of the new interim government, as you just mentioned there, Paul, but also has a fairly upbeat tone.
Some Syrians have been surprised by the leader of the opposition, Mohammed al-Julani, appointing an interim government that is basically of one color. This interim government with a small cabinet are from the Salvation Front. They are all Islamist. Some of the opposition came out to criticize and say they haven't been consulted, they haven't been included. We can't see that there are women or any other minority groups represented in this government. And the voices have started to rise and, in criticism about this. But at the same time, they're saying that this is only interim government. It's only going to run for 3 months to make sure that there is a soft handover of power, handover of duties, get the services running in the country. But I think the most important thing here is that people are not afraid of speaking out anymore. People are not afraid of criticizing, of saying that we don't like this and we want this. So they are voicing their concerns. And one example to give, for example, the the state television that was 3 days ago, providing propaganda for the Assad regime, now it is talking about what the opposition wants and even changed the flag. And at some point, there were lots of Islamic chanting, lots of Quranic verses on the television. And after criticism, that was already immediately stopped because they've respected people's views and that this is not representative of the whole country. I think people are really carefully watching how the rebels are working on the ground. From what we've witnessed and what people have seen and told us, they're very disciplined. They're very irrespective of people's rights on the ground. There are some mobs coming in, like there was a case of a woman who somebody came to her and told her, you have to put the scarves up, and then the rebels came and pushed them away from the neighborhood and said you don't have rights to interfere in people's lives.
So that started with, a couple of concerns about the interim government not being particularly pluralistic. They're all from HTS's factions. But then sort of two anecdotes suggesting this new government was being fairly responsive and disciplined. So they took over the TV station. They put some Islamic chants on it. People didn't like it, so they responded to that. They listened. They stopped it. And then when it came to the second anecdote, you had some mobs trying to tell women how they should dress. And then people, or more disciplined members of the rebel group, saying, no, this is not how we behave. So it's a very sort of positive image being put forward there. The Financial Times also had a fairly glowing piece today about the rebels. So their reporter attended a meeting between a HTS technocrat named Mohammed Yasser Ghazal and civil servants from Assad's old regime. Ghazal had helped set up the breakaway Syrian Salvation Government. That was in the HTS-run northern Idlib region. And in the session attended by the FT, this gentleman was trying to get some of the bureaucrats who had worked for Assad on side. So they report this. The atmosphere in the room was charged, but people felt comfortable enough to air their grievances. One woman screamed about discrimination she experienced under the previous leadership for being a Christian, accusing the state of making her pay $25,000 in bribes. Another woman accused her as lying. And then Ghazal, so this is the HTS-backed guy, Ghazal politely asked them to bring these issues to him later, but let them carry on. He addressed employees with, "Excuse me, and if you please," a respectful tone almost never struck by men in his seat, the seat being sort of the one of the person with authority in the room, and the implication being that's not how Assad's people spoke to their employees. The piece goes on to say, Ghazal spoke of the new government's aversion to the old regime's atavistic procedures. In Idlib, a long-neglected corner of the country that was fully cut off after rebels took it over early in the conflict, everything is digitized, and you can get an ID in 5 minutes, he said. In Damascus, it could take months, and usually needs a bribe. It took 15 minutes for Financial Times journalists to receive their media accreditation from the recently arrived government, unimaginable in the Kafkaesque old regime, which had not awarded Western journalists permits to enter the country in years. Paul, I wanted your thoughts on this because, the Financial Times piece was very interesting. Clearly the journalists have got sort of a good in to attend this meeting between HTF and the old guard. But it did sound a little bit too good to be true, right? These are not only really polite guys, they want to be inclusive, but they're also really efficient. They had a great ID system in their breakaway province, which they're now going to bring to the rest of Syria. Are people maybe getting a bit carried away?
I fear so, but this is a classic case where you hope very much that you're wrong in what you're saying. I hope really that it does succeed. It's been marvelous so far in what's already happened. Compared with the situation that the Syrians were in before, then it is really good. And just as an aside, I think, all this talk about sort of stopping the asylum process, I think is very dangerous because you've got people who've been through hell. And if you're taking that away as a possibility, I think that's a real difficulty. The idea that people are going to be able to go back to Syria very quickly, I think, is really very unfair and may raise false expectations. But back to what you were saying, yes, there have been reports from reliable sources that there have been problems within Idlib province and there have been opposition to the regime. How deep that is, it's difficult to say. But certainly that has occurred. And people are arguing, people who you would normally respect from within the region are arguing that, yes, it does look good, but in a sense, ATS had to do that. It had to reach out to people. It was going to have any chance of doing what it's done. Yes, I very much hope that, within 3 months, you will get a real coalition developing, which really works. One does worry, though, because in the wider scheme, going back to what you were saying right at the start of this, is we're looking at a regional context as well. And there are powerful regional players, certainly Turkey, certainly Israel, without a question, and the United States, and directly, indirectly, still Iran. And I would also have to say, don't leave the Russians out of this. They will be very keen to maintain their interests. It's the only foothold, even toehold, that they have in the Middle East at present. So I think there's a lot going on. But yes, let us hope that it does work, but be cautious as well. The problem is, I think that the Assad regime has been coming apart in many ways very slowly over the last 2 or 3 years. Not really discernible, but what you have seen is the different factions, which we went through earlier on, are becoming rather more powerful. And it really it is a question of whether people can trust each other enough to work together in the short term. That will depend very much on the leadership from HTS, and a lot will count on that. If within 2 or 3 weeks, then the kind of meeting that the FT was describing is the regular thing, then that is really good news. But I think one has to hold on at the moment because it's quite easy to be carried away in the natural euphoria of what is very good news.
And I wanted to draw finally sort of on your experience as, a veteran follower of events like these. And when it came to the fall of Assad, I mean, we were talking about it on this show, myself and Aaron, on Friday, sort of the obvious examples you reach for when a government falls in the Middle East, don't tend to be particularly positive. So sort of the obvious ones that come to mind is Iraq, where sort of Saddam's fall, obviously under very different circumstances, leads to sort of sectarian chaos, and then in Libya, where it leads to sort of state failure, essentially. Although Libya in a slightly different situation now, of course. I wanted to know from you, are there any sort of positive examples we can look to in the Middle East or elsewhere when you sort of have a government which collapses sort of surprisingly quickly, and then rebel groups actually take the country in a good direction? What are the examples we could look at for that sort of positive example?
Difficult to think of ones that sort of really work. I mean, there's a huge range. I mean, if you look at what happened in the Balkans, look at what has happened in the case of some of the sub-Saharan African coups and coup attempts. Yes, there are examples. I mean, you go right back to the Idi Amin period right back in Uganda many years ago, when he was eventually ousted, and in fact, Obote came back for a short while. It was protracted, but there was a transition eventually. And you do see that elsewhere. I think as far as the Middle East is concerned, it comes back time and time again to the issue of trust and whether we will see that. One thing I think which is positive is if you contrast, say, Iraq with Syria, speaking in very broad terms, I think very cautiously, generally speaking, the interconfessional relations in Syria have been better, considering the nature of the regime under which people have been living, than you would say in Iraq in a similar period. Yes, there was a lot of interconfessional contact and intermarriage and the rest in the Saddam Hussein era. But once that regime went, then essentially you did have a very strong indication of difficulties. That was partly because, in a sense, Saddam Hussein and his power, the clique and the rest, were drawing largely on just one confessional group, basically the Sunni Muslims. Now, to some extent, you're in a situation like that in Syria, where you do have the Alawis, who are broadly within the Shia scheme of things, who really control things, and essentially Assad ruled through that group. Now, that, I think, could be rather ominous. But as I say, more generally, Syria has a record over many years of rather more peaceful interconfessional relations. And that is one sign where we can look with maybe some degree of hope.
Really, really interesting. Paul Rogers, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you on the show. If you're one of the thousands of Britons living in private rented accommodation, and presumably millions actually, then you'll already know that rents have risen steeply in recent years. But a new report by property website Zoopla has now revealed just how sharp that uptick has been. In just 3 years, the annual rent for a newly let UK home has grown by £3,240. That's £270 a month. The growth in rental costs has also far outstripped pay growth, which is sort of the key relationship, really, isn't it, between your salary and how much you have to pay in rent. On that comparison, rents have risen by nearly 30% since 2021. Wages have only increased by 19%. So a much steeper rise in rents than a rise in pay. For once, though, this year, the highest increases aren't being felt in London. The capital's rental market has slowed significantly as tenants reach the limit of what they're able to afford to spend on rent, and the highest increases are now being felt in places with lower overall rental costs. So in Northern Ireland, rents increased by nearly 11% this year, while in the northwest of England, they jumped by nearly 9%. And the increasing cost of housing isn't just making a dent in people's pay packets, it's also making many people homeless. Housing charity Shelter has today revealed that homelessness has risen by 14% across England in just a year, and they blame soaring private rents, rising evictions, and a lack of social housing for the crisis. In the last 12 months, an additional 45,000 people became homeless on any given night. More than 350,000 people in England are now homeless, including over 160,000 children. Really, really shocking. Shelter's chief executive, Polly Neat, told The Guardian this: we do not have homes that people on low incomes can actually afford to rent. Private rents are going up and up. People are getting evicted. They go to the council because they are homeless, and the council has no social homes. We've got a perfect storm. This isn't a kind of existential crisis that we don't know the answer to. The answer is to build homes that people on low incomes can afford to rent. I'm joined now by Helena, aka NoJustice MTG. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Not a particularly cheery story to start you on. What do you make of this news?
Well, I mean, is it any wonder that we have had so many years of continued poor policy in terms of macro financial policy, in terms of quantitative easing going into the hands of people buying up houses that they use to push up the prices whilst we constrain the supply? We need a really, really, really big overhaul of everything to do with our housing sector, basically from top to bottom at this point. In a world in which we've privatized so much of our social housing, we need to change what we have done to our housing system over the past 40 years. Now, this is going to come in multiple different ways, but I think the main two areas is dealing with the problem of rogue landlords being able to push up rent as much as they want, and dealing with our supply crisis that we have at the moment, because these are both problems. I'm a homeowner, right? I'm somebody who owns their own home, and even I have been radicalized over the housing crisis. Hearing my friends tell me about how much they pay in rent as somebody who was renting only 2 years ago has pushed me to the edge in terms of policy, and I think we need to get pretty radical. So when it comes to supply, I full on think we need to repeal and replace the Town and Country Planning Act. It is restricting house building far too much. People go far too overboard in terms of blocking developments in their area, and this is massively restricting the overall supply, which is pushing up rents. This is absolutely true. And we should replace it with a proper zoning system so we can actually have areas where people are going to build and people accept where they're going to build, whilst having other protected areas as well, rather than just having a green belt, which, regardless of whether or not it's actually green or not, just never gets built on ever. This is restricting our supply far too much. Obviously, the response to this would be, so you're just allowing the cowboy private developer industry to be able to go run riot? Absolutely, that's not what I'm saying. What we should be doing is creating a national state-owned home building developer. We should absolutely have one. Even Labour Together, a group that I am fiercely opposed to, even they had the idea in the run-up to the election of having GB Homes as a state-owned home builder, a state-owned developer, for us to be able to take whatever future zoning system we may have and be able to build new social and council houses quickly. They need to be council and social houses, and they should be high density, so we maximise how many we can build as cheaply as we can, as efficiently as we can, whilst maximising green space. These are loads of things that we could do pretty quickly to try and get houses being built right now and make them owned by the state. And they really need to be owned by the state because, of course, the problem is that at the moment landlords have too much control over our housing market. They have too much control to be able to push up rents. They are the whole market, essentially. If you are somebody who is not living at home and who is not a homeowner, you're not going to get on a social housing list. You have to go to the private rented sector, and these people have a giant monopoly on it. In fact, things are getting so ridiculous insofar as how much landlords have been able to take huge control of our housing supply, in that even in the socially rented sector, charities are renting off of landlords, off of private landlords to provide social homes, and they're acting just as a middleman for essentially not-for-profits to be able to provide these things. It's honestly, the system is totally broken. It's totally broken. We need to be weaponizing compulsory purchase orders on people who are land banking to threaten them with the CPO unless they actually develop the land that they've bought, because this is a problem that's stopping us building new housing. And I think we could even get as radical as Clive Betts, who's a Labour MP in Sheffield, who, when he was previously the head of the Housing Select Committee in government, or in Parliament, sorry, he called on the government, or suggested to the government, that we should be compulsory purchasing houses from problem landlords. So landlords that don't follow the rules, that provide substandard accommodation for their tenants, they should be having their housing bought off them by the state and turned into social housing to get them out of the sector. That is something I support as well. And in fact, we should be looking towards what Sadiq Khan is doing in London, what the Greens have been proposing for a long time, which is the right to buy back, which is, of course, the state buying housing on the open market to turn it into social housing, drive rents down by maximizing our social housing sector so that the private sector has to compete with the public sector to make sure that they have as good a quality and as cheaper prices. We should be really looking at every single possible angle that we can, because if we carry on the way we are, it's never going to be a solved problem. Just building a small amount, even 1.5 million, which isn't a huge amount in reality, is only going to push prices down by a couple of percentage points, which isn't enough to be able to deal with our housing crisis and the massively increasing rents that we've seen over the past 2 years. It's a real problem.
Helena, I said I wasn't starting you on a cheery story, but you've left me feeling positively inspired. I back your manifesto for housing in Britain. Full-fledged on board. Let's build loads of houses. Let's have a British, what was it called? Great British House Builders? That's what everything's called these days, isn't it?
GB Homes, I think it was called.
GB Homes, yeah, that makes sense. GB, not necessarily GB Homes for GB workers, GB Homes for anyone living in GB, hopefully. And we'll have an inclusive system. But no, totally back that. As I often say on the show, I find it quite frustrating when people say, oh, it's not about supply, it's about this. It's about all of the above. Just do anything we possibly can to make more houses.
Everything, yeah, absolutely.
Everything above.
Also, I would add one more thing as well, actually. I'd add one more thing. We need to stop big foreign multinational companies buying private housing. Even if we increase the supply of private housing and it gets bought out by multinational entities using it to be able to hold for value, that's not going to increase the supply of rented homes either. We need to block big business buying up private accommodation as well. That's another big thing that we should be doing.
Because there's no point in new houses if so many of them remain empty. I talked to my good friend Aiden Dickadam about this a fair amount. He's a councillor in Battersea, and they had the Nine Elms project. In general, I'm in favour of building big towers. Means more units. Lots of them are lived in, but it has doubled the number of empty homes in the borough because so many of them are owned by super rich people who just live in there half the time or don't live in there much at all. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has announced a total ban on the use of puberty blockers by people under the age of 18. The ban comes after NHS prescriptions for puberty blockers were halted in March, and it follows a temporary ban put in place in May by the last government. Now, that ban stopped children with gender dysphoria in the UK from buying puberty blockers from European or private prescribers. It's that ban which has now been extended indefinitely. Laying out his reasoning in Parliament, Wes Streeting said this.
In the past few months, I have met with young trans people who have been, may be, or will be affected by the decisions I and my predecessor have taken. I've listened to their concerns, their fears, and their anxieties, and I want to talk to them directly now. I know it's not easy being a trans kid in our country today. The trans community is at the wrong end of all of the statistics for mental ill health, self-harm, and suicide. I can't pretend to know what that's like, but I do know what it's like to feel you have to bury a secret about yourself, to be afraid of who you are, to be bullied for it, and then to experience the liberating experience of coming out. I know it won't feel like it based on the decisions I'm taking today, but I really do care about this, and so does this government. I'm determined to improve the quality of care and access to healthcare for all trans people. I am convinced that the full implementation of the CAS review will deliver material improvements in the well-being, safety and dignity of trans people of all ages. And this government will work with them to help them live freely, equally, and with the dignity that everyone in our country deserves.
So as Wes Streeting referred to there, this ban follows the recommendations of the CAS report. That was a government commissioned study that found there was insufficient evidence about the long-term outcomes for children and teenagers prescribed puberty blockers. She didn't actually advise a ban in that report, but she has spoken now positively about this move by Wes Streeting today. That's Hilary Cass, who wrote the report. The advice, or this decision actually from Wes Streeting, also follows newer advice from the Commission on Human Medicines, which found, quote, an unacceptable safety risk in the continued prescription of puberty blockers to children, unquote. According to the Commission, some children were prescribed the medication after filling out an online questionnaire and participating in just one Zoom call. The ban will be reviewed in 2027, and any breach of it will be a criminal offence, though it won't impact young people who are already taking puberty blockers. Those people will be able to continue to get the medicine from a UK registered prescriber so long as they already have a valid prescription. Streeting also pledged that the government would set up a clinical trial into the use of puberty blockers next year, with the aim of establishing a clear evidence base for the use of the drugs. And he pledged that NHS England would set up new gender identity services for young people following the closure of London's Tavistock Centre. Now, as you can imagine, there's been a lot of reaction to the ban in Parliament. Labour's Rachel Taylor gave an account of how the lack of gender identity services had impacted a child in her constituency.
He was referred by his GP when he was in year 8 for gender dysphoria. He has still not been seen by a specialist, and he's now in his first year doing his A-levels. He's had to endure going through periods, suffering at school with the embarrassment of that. He decided to stop eating and was then diagnosed with anorexia, because that was the only way that he felt that he could stop his periods and stop his breasts growing. These are the kinds of things that trans young people go through day in, day out. 3.5 years later, it's not good enough that he has still not been seen by a medical professional. And he is in the West Midlands, one of the areas where we're not yet announcing specialist services are going to be extended.
So that was a statement sort of about healthcare for young trans people. I'm not sure if there was sort of a particular point there made about puberty blockers, which is, you know, what was being announced there. Although actually Wes Streeting would say that he was also announcing these new services. After Streeting's statement, Green Party Deputy Leader Zach Polansky said this: Wes Streeting's decision to ban puberty blockers should be called out for what it is. He's playing culture wars where trans and non-binary youth are collateral damage, and Labour dance to reform's tune. An attack on trans people is an attack on our LGBTQ plus community. We must say no. Others were more celebratory, with now independent but former Labour MP Rosie Duffield saying this: love and gratitude to every person who has spoken up against the scandal of puberty blockers over the last few years. To all of us cancelled, blanked, ignored or gaslit. Hannah's B, I think that's Hannah Barnes, who wrote a book about this sort of issue. She says, "You Shiro," and thank you, Wes Streeting. Helena, obviously very, a very emotional topic. Wes Streeting in Parliament trying to say, I've made this decision, but I stand with trans people. Do you think that's consistent?
It's a difficult one. It's really difficult to comment on. The thing is, as well, is it's not a ban on puberty blockers. It's a ban on puberty blockers specifically for treating gender dysphoria, specifically for trans people. It's not for people who have precocious puberty. They will still be able to access these things just fine. Now, it's obviously better if they're going to do a clinical trial to then be able to find out whether or not there is a reason for keeping them legal or not, or keeping them unbanned or not. But that's not going to help all the people. If in the end of that trial, they find out that there's no reason to have them banned, who've had to go through a puberty that they don't want throughout the entirety of that time period. I think you'd struggle to find any trans person. For someone myself, I started transitioning at the age of, or medically transitioning at the age of 28. If I'd have had access to these things a lot younger, I'd have a much higher quality of life now. But that's looking in retrospect. Whereas when you actually look at the problems people are now facing, people really do need these things. People have real tangible stories of trauma that they have to go through from experiencing the wrong puberty. And that's happening immediately right now. Lots of these people don't have time to wait. And even then, a trial that they might do has already been called out by the Council of Europe as potentially being unethical. Because if you're doing a double-blind trial and the people who are on the blind end who are receiving the placebo, they're going to already know that they're not going to actually getting access to these medication in reality, because they're going to start going through puberty anyway, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences of being unlucky to be put in the control group there, and that could have serious ethical ramifications. And the big problem of all this is that I feel like it's a slippery slope for much further. He says wants to implement the recommendations of the CAS review. And as you said in your piece there, this was not recommended by the CAS review. In fact, if you go into the CAS review, if you find Appendix 8 in the CAS review, they show that they actually reviewed, hundreds of different records and different pieces of information of trans kids who had to use puberty blockers, and in literally 0 cases was that treatment removed due to professional advice or due to side effects, right? 0, absolutely no cases within the CAS's own information that was provided in the review. And Hilary Cass herself at the time even said there is an undue disproportionate focus on puberty blockers as an issue. And I think that there's a reason for this. I think there's a reason why we have a disproportionate focus on puberty blockers as a very specific part of the debate about trans people. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a quote from a statement made by a speaker at GenSpec's conference in Lisbon, GenSpec being kind of gender critical pressure group. Well, we certainly want to stop gender medicine and protect women's sports, but that's not enough. And that's when the thing that has caused so much trouble as this idea is spread, namely that everything is connected and they can start to work with this. Sports means changing rooms as well as competitions. It means the development pipeline as well as elite competitions. That means sport in schools. If you can't lie about who's a boy and a girl who's playing sport, how can you lie elsewhere in school? No gender child medicine means an end to the idea of the trans child. It means no longer teaching children transitioning is a thing. It means you can't pretend boys are girls and girls are boys. And once you stop that pretense, it's obvious the world's boy and girl in school mean rules and safeguarding. If you can't let boys go into girls' space in school without endangering kids, you can't keep them out without being clear who is actually a boy and who is actually a girl. Then you can make the same argument for adults. First in spaces where there's someone who knows everyone in there's duty of care, for example, prisons or workplaces, and then other spaces too. Because if men can't use women's toilets at work, then why on earth will let them do so in the shopping centre? This is the real importance of the UK's ban on puberty blockers. There is not really a serious treatment option in the UK, and I don't think more than hundreds of kids have taken them, certainly not more than a few thousand. What they are is a rhetorical and argumentative device. And that's the thing. That's what I believe the focus on the puberty blockers is. It's a specific Trojan horse to be able to try and get people to accept one removal of the rights of trans people as a rhetorical engine to be able to justify all of the rest of them. Well, if we can't allow kids to go through this kind of gender-affirming care, well, then they can't go through further when they become age of 18. We can start rolling back other trans people's care as well. We can start talking about rolling back other things like societal transition for young people too. I think that this is a rhetorical device that's being used to create a slippery slope of further things. And so when Streeting says things like, well, trans kids are being unheard, trans people unheard, well, he did meet a big group of trans people. There's a great post from India Willoughby talking about somebody who was in this meeting about the emotionally charged atmosphere in the room at the time, speaking to Streeting, all of the emotional pleas to not ban what they believe themselves to be incredibly important medicines for themselves as trans kids. And apparently he recognized the emotional nature of people's pleas to him to not ban it, and then he went ahead and did it anyway. Yet when it comes to a group of Christian nurses, or a group of nurses, backed by Christian Legal, who were complaining about having to share changing rooms with trans people, they got their own special meeting. And it's looking like there's already been intimations towards alleged changes into NHS operational procedure that would disadvantage trans people specifically. So do I have the best of thoughts? Am I hopeful about Wes Streeting's position as in the Department of Health and Social Care to treat trans people with dignity and with respect? No, I don't have any trust in him at all.
I mean, I totally take your point that this is the kind of thing that will be used by people who are just in general opposed to trans rights. I suppose where I'm sort of reluctant to completely dismiss where Wes Streeting is coming from is he has been advised, by a couple of sort of medical bodies or reports. Obviously, there are medical bodies in different countries who completely disagree. So it seems to me like there is genuine debate here, and some of it is not necessarily being had for ulterior motives. It's that there's genuine medical disagreement. And I suppose for me, why it seems like there's almost something irresolvable with puberty blockers is because it seems sort of from the literature that many people who suffer gender dysphoria when they're children will always want to be trans, and other people who suffer gender dysphoria when they're children, it might resolve without them becoming trans. And one of the things that where people can sort of work out if this is a temporary or a permanent thing is puberty. So I think it said in the Cass review that there are studies which show that one of the things which does resolve or which can resolve gender dysphoria in young people is puberty, which then sort of makes them feel more aligned with the sex that they were assigned at birth. Now, and why I think this is impossible is because obviously the people for whom the gender dysphoria is not temporary, they would be much better having puberty blockers, right? So obviously if you are going to be trans your whole life, it's much better to start transitioning before puberty than afterwards. But if you give people puberty blockers, then you're not going to know if they would be the kids with gender dysphoria for whom it might be resolved without transitioning. Do you see where I'm coming from? So it seems to me that there is a genuine sort of issue which is very difficult to resolve as sort of someone doing a well-meaning study into what is the best medical care for people. A separate question about whether a ban is sensible. I think you probably should leave it to the medical profession. But I suppose, what do you think of the idea that there is, lots of the people who are working on this, making decisions about this, might be motivated by just this being quite a new, complex medical issue, not necessarily using this as kind of a battering ram to try and roll back trans rights more generally?
I think that you could probably find plenty of people who are only taking in what they believe to be an evidence-based approach, right? Who are only looking in what they believe is a dispassionate and objective viewpoint. But as you've already said there are plenty of people who are medical professionals who don't have a skin in the game, who've come to different conclusions, very, very wildly different or maybe slightly different conclusions on this issue. And I think around the issues that you raised there, the difficulty comes in, well, how can you trust politicians, especially politicians like Wes Streeting, who, from what I've seen, have very clear biases on this issue, going on to Julia Hartley-Brewer's show on Talk TV and instantly dismissing the existence of trans people, or going on to Harry Cole in The Sun and saying, well, if you'd asked me before, I'd said that trans people are the gender they say they are, but now I'm going to have a different opinion. Can you trust a politician specifically to take into account the plurality of voices in the room and come to an evidence-based opinion on that? Or can you only rely on them to pick and choose the kind of information that they want to be able to implement into policy? This is the problem that we have with things like think tanks, for example, in that they're not there to have a dispassionate, evidence, objective-based view in totality of the evidence. They're there to push a specific political angle, and they are used by politicians to be able to have evidentiary support for the policies they wanted to implement anyway. So whether or not the actual scientists and the statisticians and the people who are doing these studies themselves are doing these things in earnest or sincerely, they probably are. But I don't think you can trust politicians, let alone Wes Streeting, to give you the totality of the evidence to come to the correct political decision.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think where I stand on this is I think there is a genuine question. I'm concerned, I think, when I see people say anyone sort of interested in this or caring about this or thinks that there is a genuine sort of challenge, to be resolved, must have ulterior motives. I think that's problematic. At the same time, I think probably it shouldn't be in the hands of politicians, and a ban does seem over the top. Why not leave it to medical practitioners and have some strong guidelines or whatever?
Let parents and the kids themselves be able to make their own personal judgment as to whether this is something that they want to do. As far as I'm concerned, I agree with Tim Waltz on this issue. What is between a doctor and a patient themselves should be up to them. It should be between them. It should be confidential. It should be entirely their decision. And the government getting involved is state overreach, in my mind.
Luigi Mangione is currently being held in a Pennsylvania jail as he fights extradition to New York to face a murder charge for the shooting of a health insurance CEO last week. Arriving at his extradition hearing yesterday, Mangione had this message for reporters.
As completely out of touch as an insult to the intelligence of the American people and its lived experience.
In case you missed it, Mangione shouted out, "This is completely unjust and an insult to the intelligence of the American people and their lived experience." Now, in Pennsylvania, Mangione is only facing lesser charges for forgery, falsely identifying himself and carrying a gun without a license. But this was his lawyer, Thomas Dickey, addressing the bigger charge, the murder charge, which he's facing in New York.
Listen, I haven't seen any evidence that says that he's the shooter. So that's, like I said earlier, and I wasn't kidding around. A couple of things. If you're going to report something, report accurately. And remember, and this is not just a small thing, the fundamental concept of American justice is a presumption of innocence. And until you're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And I've seen zero evidence at this point.
Really? Everyone, there's so many great characters in this whole thing. Evidence, zero evidence. I suppose, unfortunately for the lawyer, he does seem he's going to have a difficult job ahead of him. Evidence against Mangione does appear to be mounting. So police say that Mangione had considered using a bomb to kill United Healthcare boss Brian Thompson, but ruled it out because, quote, it could kill innocents. That's according to a notebook police say they found amongst Mangione's belongings. And Mangione's handwritten 260-word manifesto has also now been published. In it, he said this: "I do apologize for any strife or traumas, but it had to be done. Frankly, these parasites simply had it coming. A reminder, the US has the #1 most expensive healthcare system in the world, yet we rank roughly number 42 in life expectancy. United is the indecipherable largest company in the US by market cap, behind only Apple, Google, Walmart. It has grown and grown, but has our life expectancy? No, the reality is they've simply gotten too powerful, and they continue to abuse our country for immense profit because the American public has allowed them to get away with it." I suppose presumably the lawyer is going to be saying that's a forgery. I don't know. If he's saying that there's zero evidence, he's hopefully going to have to prove that all of these texts which have been ascribed to Mangione weren't actually Mangione's. Interestingly, though, as we've been talking about all week, it seems that segments of the American public agree with Mangione's assessment. Since the killing last week, large numbers have expressed emotions on social media, ranging from indifference to jubilation at the shooting. Some have even offered to pay his legal fees, according to his attorney. Others appear to have been inspired. In New York, wanted posters featuring photographs and details of other healthcare executives have appeared in public spaces. Some even include murdered CEO Brian Thompson with his face crossed out. Now, I do think that's very unpleasant, sort of putting up the faces of people, sort of, I suppose, inviting people to take violent action against them. According to CNN, health insurance companies have been taking the threat of copycats seriously, closing headquarters, scrubbing their websites of executive photographs, and increasing armed security details for key leaders. Of course, though, it's not Mangione's alleged crime that's garnering him the most international attention. It's those abs and those eyebrows. And even the right-wing press can't get enough. He's featured on the Daily Mail's front page, where their writer confesses to being conflicted about the hot assassin. The Times managed to unearth a lesser-known topless pic of the hot assassin. Meanwhile, Unheard magazine described Mangione as America's everyman and a folk hero. And Unheard, which is sort of an ideologically heterodox website, but generally anti-woke, couldn't resist the alleged killer's internet-breaking shirtless pic. According to The Telegraph, though, the global firsting for the CEO killer was actually all concocted by the woke. It's unclear precisely which social justice warrior is responsible for Mangione's defined abs and chiseled jawline. Helena, this sort of started on the internet, and you could see how this became a massive thing on sort of like Twitter, everyone pointing out these good-looking fella, and while no one would endorse the actions he took, he's he writes somewhat, articulately about it. It does seem surprising how open the Daily Mail, the Times, I mean, the Telegraph was blaming the woke left or Unheard. All these magazines seem quite happy to kind of go along with this. I'd have thought that this would be sort of a moment where the right wing would be saying, right-wing press or centrist press saying it's disgraceful that everyone is thirsting over this killer, but they seem kind of happy to go along with it all.
I mean, what's interesting to me is that there were some immediate right-wing pieces put out, maybe not in the actual mainstream press, but in terms of right-leading influencers on the internet, by like Ben Shapiro's and the Matt Walshes of this world, saying the revolutionary left is out of hand, celebrating this killer of the CEO. This is terrible. In fact, Piers Morgan got furious with Taylor Lorenz having a little chuckle about the incident on his YouTube show, because that's what Piers Morgan is now, a YouTuber rather than a real journalist, but I digress. And they were furious, saying it's terrible that people might be celebrating this as a cold-blooded killer, and anybody talking about him or making light of the situation is morally poisoned and they're evil. And their comment sections were just flooded with people going, actually, no, this isn't a left-right issue. This isn't a woke, anti-woke issue. Like, Americans of all different political stripes, they all have to deal with the American healthcare service, and all of them are absolutely furious. In fact, one comment said, I've just realized Ben Shapiro's business model relies on getting normal people to hate each other. And I think that, obviously, I don't think that people from the Telegraph or the Times or the Daily Mail or whatever have gone into Ben Shapiro's comment section to try and see what the public mood is. But we all saw the number of ha-ha reactions on the United Healthcare Facebook post. This is something that has bipartisan, not support, but they're the feelings of being less than sympathetic for the CEO themselves. This is something that has crossed many different political ideological lines, especially in America. And if you're a newspaper, if you're a paper like the Daily Mail or the Times or whatever, and you rely on people buying and actually interacting with your paper, you can't put people off buying them in the future. And at a time when everybody, and even people who don't even use the American healthcare system, like people in the UK, are looking at this going, well, we don't condemn murder, but if you are causing a lot of social murder in your company, we can't be too sympathetic with you. These papers that actually have a desire to sell these things to people and keep readers engaged, they're not going to say something that massively disagrees with what the vast plurality of people are thinking about this. And it's a good story, What's going viral of this? Is it serious liberal think pieces about how we can't let our society fall to revolutionary violence? No, it's people talking about how hot he is and what's the statements made in his manifesto, and commenting on all of the TikToks of people making funny memes about, my FBI agent who's listening into our conversation forgot about the fact that I said in Minecraft about the situation with regards to CEOs having their names plastered all over New York or whatever. So if you're trying to sell, you're not going to try and lean into the things that aren't getting traction on the internet. The thing that's made this story popular is the outpouring of lack of sympathy in America and the meme status. The meme status of he has become a meme overnight, right? You don't go from no followers to 300,000 followers on Twitter without becoming a meme cult celebrity figure. And the papers who rely on circulation are buying into that, in my mind.
I think that's very well put. Yeah, they just can't help but get on the bandwagon because this is selling papers. Really interesting. I mean, as I say, I don't condone sort of putting up posters of CEOs sort of with targets on them. But if you worked in that industry, beyond feeling fear for your personal safety, which I sympathize with them for, realizing that people hate your industry so much that someone who killed a leading figure in your industry is now being celebrated as, essentially a hero by many people, but even among like the Times of London are just sort of talking about this guy like he's a really hot guy who's sort of just a celebrity. Must be really, really surreal, really, really bizarre. Hopefully making them rethink their industry a little bit, even if not via sort of means we can get behind. Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's always a pleasure having these discussions with you.
Thank you for having me. Cheers for the story tonight. It was a good one.
Thank you guys for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow, of course, for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.